friends. It's a delight to be here today with Professor Judith Butler, who's Maxine Elliot Professor in the Department of Comparative Literature and the Program of Critical Theory at the University of California, Berkeley. She received her PhD in philosophy from Yale University in 1984. She's the author of many books, including her latest, The Force of Nonviolence, which was published by Verso Press in 2020. Thank you so much for taking time to talk.
Yeah, I'm pleased to be here.
Thank you. So to jump right in here, how has your Jewish identity impacted your approach to ethics and morality in your work in general?
Okay, it's an excellent question. When I was very young, I took courses at my synagogue. It was part of the general Jewish education program, but I always signed up for the ethics class because I really enjoyed those debates and I found them existentially pertinent, and of course that was the 1960s and early 70s, I suppose, and I was part of a post-war generation that was trying to make sense of how people made choices during the Second World War, whether Jews fled or hid, or how they could be part of resistance, or how they could offer support for one another under conditions that were, as we know, utterly atrocious. And so I read a great deal, and it actually produced for me an interest in philosophy. I started to read Spinoza. I read Maimonides, and I developed a way of thinking about the world through my Jewish education and the philosophy texts that emerged from that. And I think that continues to be true today. I've recently published on Martin Buber, and as you know, Buber had an idea that we're not just these bounded individuals separate from one another, but that we live in a living relationship with one another. And what does that mean, to be in a living relationship with another? It means that my life is bound up with another's life, and what happens to that other's life affects me because I am connected with them through this living relation.
Yeah, it seems that in our current moment, that seems to be more understood than ever before, perhaps.
Yes, I think it's true. We share conditions of life. We share the breath. We share the air. We share the surfaces of the world, right? They connect us for better and for worse.
Yeah. So as an authority in gender theory, how do you envision the field in another 10 years? Do you think it'll be significantly different from now?
You know, the field goes in so many different directions. I mean, I think that, as you know, there's a vibrant trans community. There's a vibrant community of people who are choosing other language with which to describe themselves, including non-binary and others. And this has been a time of both great experimentation, but also a time in which we've learned a lot about how people have suffered by being slotted into the wrong categories, and we've had to think about what their rights are and what their well-being consists in. It's not just a luxury to play with gender. It is a lived necessity to find a way in one's body and in language to live and breathe and to be well in the world. But also, I think the feminist movement has strengthened. It takes very different forms across the world, but it's part of gender studies and always has been. The struggle against violence against women, which is unfortunately heightened under the coronavirus conditions. The study for the struggle for economic and social equality continues, and a struggle for freedom, a struggle to be able to live in the world without fear and with the possibility of moving through the world in a way that without being assaulted or without fearing harassment of some kind.
Yeah. Speaking of lived necessity, many fairly or unfairly think of the field of philosophy as dealing with abstractions are relevant to one's life. How do you think that the philosophical field can be more relevant to American lives today?
Well, I don't know. Every taxi driver I've ever had is a philosopher, right? Because they're really basic questions like, how do I live? What do I do? What gives me meaning? What gives us meaning? Am I connected to others? If so, how? What do I owe others? What do they owe me? And I think that they're basic questions of how to become oriented in the world, but they're also ethical questions of what is the good life, or what is the best way to live? And, I think people are asking that question all the time.
Yeah. Okay, so just the last question for you today. How has the coronavirus and this just current crisis we're immersed in, which you've started to touch on, changed or enhanced or altered any of your thinking or theories, or any reflections you have just on this moment of quarantine, and how many lives are being affected, billions of lives around the world?
Yeah, well, I have several thoughts about that. Maybe I'll start with a more local one and then move towards the more global. The local one is this: I have a son who lives in the next town, and he's been more in the world than I am. I am practicing isolation, and can I see my son? I see him at a distance. He comes in the backyard, but I cannot hug my son. Now, the reason I cannot hug my son, which is very rough for me, I mean, I presume it's rough for him too. Okay, we'll just assume it's a reciprocal difficulty. But the reason, it's not just that he will infect me, maybe I infect him. We don't know. We're unknowing about who is affecting whom, and who is the carrier and who is not the carrier. So we're living in a kind of darkness. We're living in a kind of opacity. We don't know who's carrying and who's not, who's communicating, who's not. And as such, there has to be a kind of special care. It is very odd to experience self-isolation as care. Care is usually giving, touching, providing, sheltering. But here I am sheltering myself. That doesn't exactly feel like care, but it is care, because I do not know whether I can hurt another. Therefore, I must stay here. Yeah. But also, it makes me think very clearly about those who do not have shelter. You cannot shelter in place if you do not have a shelter, right? You cannot even expect medical care should you develop the illness and not be able to breathe, because the medical facilities have not been properly funded, have not been properly staffed, and they don't have the proper supplies. And the reason for that is in part that this country has not put public health as a priority, as a political priority. We assume people make provisions for themselves through private means, through their place of business. But what about those who do not have a place of business, or whose place of business does not provide health care? Yeah. In effect, our privatized system abandons populations who are not able to enter that system or profit from its benefits. I don't think that healthcare should be a benefit. I think it should be a basic human right. It should be a public good that we are all committed to providing. So we're seeing the way that this virus affects people differentially according to wealth. And of course, in the global arena, we see that Ecuador cannot even cannot shelter its dead bodies. Yeah. And Italy has had to construct morgues, because we are not a world that cares about global equality. But I think global equality in healthcare and understanding healthcare as a global good, a good for all publics, is the most important lesson we can learn. And that means that we are connected not just to those who are closest to us, my Isaac, for instance, in Oakland, but also to the Ecuadorian people, even though I don't speak their language very well, right? And those are living relations.
you mentioned wealth, and we also see race. I read in Chicago, some 70 to 80% of the deaths so far have been people of color. You
Yes.
mentioned gender and being trapped with one's abuser as one example. Just horrific. And then you mentioned darkness, and as you know, the ninth plague is the plague of darkness, and it
Yes.
says over there that people couldn't move from their spot and they couldn't see one another. One of my concerns is the weakening or the diminishing of the capacity of empathy. When we can't see each other, can we still feel for each other?
I think that is a really important question. Perhaps we cannot see each other, but we have other senses, and we can sense each other without sight. And people who are unsighted know that. And I believe also that there are forms of empathy that can be developed through the internet, even though they are perhaps not as refined as I would like. But that is the big ethical challenge for us, no? To care for the other we do not know, we do not see, whose name we may not know, whose language we may not speak. We are still connected with them. That is a global obligation at this time. And it's hard to do. Just because we're in the dark does not mean we cannot act ethically.
Right. Just my last reflection on something you said before we end here. I'm really moved by how you talked about care, and that care is not some objective prescription. Care continues to evolve in different moments. And what care means in this moment is something fundamentally different.
Yes, odd.
Yeah.
Counterintuitive.
So, Professor Butler, wishing you continued health and security and success in all of your endeavors. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.